welcome to CivilNet. My guest via Skype from Amsterdam is historian and scholar Ugur Umit Ungor. He has studied genocide, mass violence. He's a lecturer at Utrecht University and Institute for War and Genocide Studies in Amsterdam. Ugur, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You have done extensive work in terms of the Armenian Genocide, Turkish state's policy of denial, of memory, of property confiscation. We just marked the Centennial of the Armenian Genocide of 1915 here in Yerevan and around the world, and also in Turkey. There were expectations that something would change, and I think that even though the Turkish government's policy hasn't changed, and even though President Recep Tayyip Erdogan didn't acknowledge the Armenian Genocide, a lot changed for the Armenian nation. What is your feeling? You were following the events, I'm sure, taking part in conferences. What is your feeling about the Centennial?
Well, the Centennial is, I think, is only important because it's going to be 100 years after the beginning of the genocide in Istanbul. But it doesn't mean just because there are 100 years has passed that there will be a change and shift in policy. I mean, policies of denial or acknowledgement, they only change because there's a significant political change, either because of a revolution or because of a brave new politician, such as in the Soviet Union. This was Gorbachev, of course, who recognized the violence that Stalinism committed. And it's not because time passes. I mean, time does not necessarily heal. On the contrary, it can only get worse, if you ask me, because denial, of course, builds up frustration over generations. And I don't think that we've come much farther now than we were, let's say, 80 years ago, or let's say 90 years ago, right after the genocide. Some things have changed, though, and this is maybe not related to the Centennial, but to the regime of the AK Party. So this is the regime or the government under Prime Minister, now President Erdogan. We have to acknowledge, this is important, I think, despite more recent developments, that this government has done quite a bit in opening up public debates about the genocide, about making possible freedom, a certain freedom of speech, freedom of publication that was absolutely impossible in the 1980s or 1990s. So whether it was the 1980s, the regime, really the dictatorship of the generals, or the 1990s, the corrupt and violent democracy that Turkey was because of the civil war, back then in the 80s and 90s, any public debate, let alone any conference on the Armenian Genocide, was absolutely impossible in Turkey. And in the past 10 years, we've come quite a long way. But at the same time, it also demonstrates what the limits are of this open debate. So I think that the current AK Party government has been able to open up certain circles of debate. Some freedoms have opened up, but there are also very clear limits to it. And the limits, or one of the things you already mentioned, is about, for example, property confiscation. And the Armenian property that was stolen during and after the genocide is so incredibly enormous that I think any public discussion about it would unleash such a call for restitution and compensation, but that debate, I think, is not possible yet in Turkey.
But it's interesting. Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt you for 1 second. The Catholicosate of the Great House of Cilicia, the Catholicos, has just initiated a lawsuit in the Constitutional Court of Turkey claiming back the Sis Catholicosate that is now Kozan, Turkey. There seems to be, again, in the Armenian world, this movement, this shift in the collective narrative that people are saying now it's not about recognition at this point, now it is about reparation. So is this going to create such a severe backlash that it will take this process back, or will it help move it forward?
Well, I think even with recognition, we're not really fully there yet, I think. I mean, if you look at liberal and intellectual circles in Istanbul, yes, of course, they're quite multicultural, and they believe that the Armenians are part of Ottoman and Turkish society. But if we travel in the cities of the eastern Turkey and take some major cities such as Erzurum, Kars, Van, and I don't think that levels of recognition are very high yet. So we need to still fight for recognition as well. We need to do this through public debates, I think, and through education. I think the only way to move forward is education. Now, the restitution thing is a different Pandora's box, because a certain recognition is in principle only a psychological process. You have to accept that your nation has committed crimes, very severe crimes, including genocide against another nation. Now, that might be just a psychological acceptance, but the moment that restitution or compensation comes into the picture, you actually have to give something up. So you might have to give up part of your firm, your company, because your company was built on the genocide and on the confiscation. Or you might have to give up some land, or in case of the Turkish army or the Turkish state properties, you might have to give some of this back to the Armenians, and maybe with reparations, even with interest. So this can go quite a long way. That's, I think, when we have a much more serious problem. Namely, people have to do material concessions. And even I know people who recognize the genocide in Turkey, and many of them have said, I recognize the genocide, it was terrible what we did to the Armenians, but I'm not going to give up my property. So this is where we hit the limits of the recognition and reparations.
Yeah, certainly. I agree that going back to our my initial question, that 100 is simply a number, but humans, we record things in round numbers, and that yes, there is a growing movement, a somewhat renaissance in Turkish, some segments of Turkish society, with movement in terms of recognizing the Armenian genocide, and yet there is a long way to go. You, in one of your articles or works, had said that as much as we Armenians are prisoners of our memory, Turkish citizens as well are prisoners of memory because of the denial that their government. Could you expand on that, please?
Yeah, I think it's this is one of the problems that relates really to our identities. So what does it mean to be Turkish or Armenian? And I think part of Armenian identity, a part of it, and for some people it's more, and for other people it's less. Part of Armenian identity is rests on the pillar of the genocide. So the genocide, the acknowledgement of the genocide, the memory of the genocide has become a pillar for many Armenians on which they build their identity. I've spoken to many Armenians all around the world, different countries, who have, the first question they would ask me is, do you recognize the genocide? And one of them even said, do you believe in the genocide? I mean, I like this idea of belief. This is not a religion, of course. This is a secular event in history that overcame generations before us. So it's become, a lot of people see this as a pillar of their identity. Now, in principle, there's nothing wrong with that, and that's normal because victim communities often have it. I mean, can you imagine a Tutsi identity without the genocide in Rwanda, or can you imagine a Jewish identity without a Holocaust? I don't think that's possible. On the other hand, we have the perpetrator group, and I really like what the German president said a couple of months ago. He said, there cannot be a German identity without Auschwitz. And so the same thing for the Turks. I think their Turkish identity rests on the pillar of the negation of the genocide. So, and we have the opposite problem, as Turks or as Turkish citizens, namely that you are a Turk if you deny the genocide. If you don't deny the genocide, then your Turkishness is called into question. So this explains to some extent why denialists, and every time a Turk talks about the genocide or recognizes it, or even worse, he does research on it like I do, then your ethnic identity is always questioned. And I think this relates partly to this problem, namely that it's become a fundamental aspect of Turkish identity to deny the genocide. So the absence of the Armenian genocide is part of our identity now, and that needs to change. But if that changes, it means that Turkish identity itself has to change. And a lot of people don't like their identity being changed.
Yeah, certainly. And as you were saying, Armenian identity is so wrapped up in the memory of genocide because certainly there are no more or very, very few witnesses or survivors left. Ugur, I realize you're an academic, you're a scholar, you're not a politician. But I want to ask you the question, how do you see the process moving forward? I mean, from the Armenian perspective, I think that, 30, 40 years of academic scholarship study of genocide, lobbying efforts in the power centers of the world by Armenian communities, the Armenian government's, position on the international recognition of the Armenian Genocide. All of that, I mean, where do we go in the next century now, in year 101? Or does the story have to develop in Turkey, independent of what we do?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, there are basically two ways of looking at it. On the one hand, we have some people who argue that, well, the recognition has been accomplished, so we don't need any external pressure on Turkey to recognize the genocide anymore. Some of these people will argue that, take the example of the Soviet Union, most kind of processes of liberalization, of acknowledgement of kind of spread of human rights regimes came from internal dynamics. So we should stop putting external pressure on Turkey and look only at internal dynamics. So we should support, for example, the democratic movement in Turkey. We should support liberal groups. We should support rights groups, women's groups, gay rights, Kurdish rights. And the more these kind of groups grow, the more the Armenian genocide will also be acknowledged. That's one interpretation. But the other interpretation argues the opposite and argues that, well, in South Africa, for example, under apartheid, apartheid didn't stop by itself because there was no external pressure. No, there was a lot of external pressure, and as a part of the result of that, the regime also ended. Now, I think that when we look to the future, I mean, we have 2 or 3 or 4 very important social problems at our hands. The first one is the precarious life situation of Armenians in Turkey, but also Armenians elsewhere, in Syria, for example, in Iraq, in Lebanon even. So, I mean, that's one of the social problems. Another social problem is that the border with the Republic of Armenia is closed, and this causes lots of economic damage for both the Republic of Armenia and especially the border region in Turkey. That's another problem. And then the third problem is, I think, the question of justice. I mean, many generations can pass, but the effects of genocide are still felt. So the Armenian genocide is maybe 3 generations or 4 generations in some case, but Native Americans have had tens of generations, and they still feel the effects of genocide, or indeed African Americans of slavery. I think we need some form of justice there as well. And the ideas, or ideas about these 3, of how these 3 social questions are supposed to be solved, they radically differ from individual to individual. Now, I have a certain position on it, and I can run you through them. I think that when we get to so the first problem, this is about the civil rights and the cultural rights of Armenians in Turkey. I said in an interview in Istanbul last week during the Centennial, the Turkish television interviewed me, and I told them I wouldn't want to live as an Armenian in Turkey. And I'm saying this as a minority. I mean, I live as a Turkish minority here in Holland. And the rights I have here, the cultural rights, the freedoms I have here, Armenians in Turkey can't even dream of it. So we need to expand that. That can only be expanded, I think, we build alliances with other groups, other small groups that are interested in expanding their rights. So building alliances, I think this is important, building bridges to other communities. And this has happened. Take somebody like Ara Sarafian. This is a colleague from London who flies to Diyarbakir and Bitlis and talks to the local Kurds there. And he explains them. He says, look, I know that none of you are individually guilty for the genocide, but it's your great-grandparents who have committed it, and we must come to terms with this. And surprisingly or interestingly, many of these Kurds, they agree, and many of them are ashamed, and they're even relieved a little bit that finally that dark secret they always had in their minds about what they did to the Armenians, finally now they can lay that secret to rest. So building these alliances, that's important. When it comes to opening the border, this is of course one of the problems that relates also to Azerbaijan, otherwise it would have been resolved with Turkey. I think Turkey should stop listening to what the Azeris say and just open the border unilaterally, no preconditions, to open the border. What happens with, of course, with economic protectionism is one of the problems. What will happen to the economy in Armenia? Yeah, you can have a referendum if you want, but it can be resolved democratically. I don't think any country has gotten worse by opening borders that used to be closed. Take the Iron Curtain. I know this out of experience a little bit. I grew up on the Dutch-German border before the European Union instituted the Schengen Treaty. The moment the Schengen Treaty opened up the borders between between European countries, I think there was almost a sigh of relief that we didn't have to worry about our neighbors anymore. And I think this is a move towards peace. I think it's absolutely clear to me. And the third problem regarding justice for the genocide, I think Turkey is an economic powerhouse. It's a very important military and as well as economic power in this region. I don't think it would lose much if it would pay reparations to the descendants of the victims all across the world, but and particularly, of course, in the Middle East, people in Syria, Lebanon, also elsewhere. And I don't think that Turkey would lose anything by it. It should take a unilateral step towards the Armenians in recognition. The Turkish president should fly to Yerevan. He should lay some flowers at Tsitsernak, and he should just apologize. And I think he would get a Nobel Prize for Peace, to be honest, if he would do such a move. So there are many problems. These are three of them, and I think these are some of the potential directions in which we can move.
Ugur, I must say, the 100 years of effort of denying could be lifted, as you said, in a matter of months or a year, and the collective sigh of relief that both Turkey and Armenia would experience because of that would certainly, I think, contribute enormously to peace in the region. So thank you for talking about these things, bringing these ideas on this platform, and to continue the narrative and the discourse, about how Armenians and Turks have to come to some kind of resolution in this 100-year-old story. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for all the work that you do. And hopefully we will reconnect with you again soon.
Thank you.
I'd like to remind our viewers that my guest was academic and scholar from Amsterdam, Ugur Umit Ungor. Stay with CivilNet.